Soviet BTRs. In the late stages of World War II, the Soviets began to practice a doctrine of tank descente. This tactic emphasized the joint action of light infantry with tanks. Since the infantry had no means to follow the rapidly advancing armored troops, soldiers were carried into battle on top of tanks. They would get off the tanks only before the actual fighting took place. Lessons learned in the war helped the Soviets start their own Armored Personnel Carrier, or APC, development program after the war ended. German Sd.Kfz 251s and American M3 half-tracks were used as a reference for the creation of the first Soviet post-war APCs, the BTR-152 and BTR-40. However, in the mid-1950s, the requirement of modern warfare and the transformation of mechanized divisions into motor rifle divisions called for the creation of new transport vehicles. Thus, a new family of 8-wheeled armored personnel carriers were born, the BTRs. For more than 6 decades, 4 generations of BTRs and thousands of vehicles have been in service and are still roaming the battlefields. BTR-60. The first in the line of BTRs was the model BTR-60. Its design served as a model for all future generations of the vehicle. Later versions had features added or modified, but in essence it was the same type of vehicle. BTR-60 was built in the winter of 1956 under the requirements of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. The Soviet Army leaders were looking for an amphibious 8-wheel, all-wheel drive vehicle with formidable cross-country ability, at least 2 turnable axles, and independent suspension. The task was given to several factories, one of them being the famous Gaz, which eventually won the contract. Even though Gaz's design was not the best, they beat their competitors through emphasis of simplicity and affordability. The Soviets needed new armored vehicles as soon as possible and didn't want to risk production halts. After it passed state trials, Gaz's design officially entered service as BTR-60. BTR-60 had a totally different design than all previous armored personnel carriers. It had 8 wheels and was built using welded sloped armored plates. The driver and commander were positioned at the front, while the troop compartment was behind them. Unusually, the engine compartment was placed at the rear of the vehicle. Surprisingly, the first version of the vehicle, the BTR-60P, had a roofless troop compartment, an essential feature of modern APCs. However, starting from 1963 and the version BTR-60PA, vehicles received armored roofs. With a roof installed, the BTR provided far better protection but reduced the capacity from 16 to 14 men. The drawback of the vehicle was that it had no side doors. Instead, the crew and the troops had to use overhead hatches on the vehicle's roof to exit, which left the vehicle exposed to enemy fire from above. In 1965, the BTR-60PB was introduced, which strove to meet new wartime standards for APCs, with the addition of a machine gun turret on top of the roof. With the introduction of a turret, the crew was forced to accommodate a gunner position, which limited the number of soldiers in the compartment area to 8. The BTR-60 was powered by 2 90-horsepower, 67-kilowatt, 6-cylinder gas engines that allowed a maximum speed of 50 miles an hour, or about 80 kilometers an hour on the road. One engine powered the first and third axle, while the other powered the second and the fourth axle. This way, if one of the engines failed, the vehicle could continue running at a reduced speed. Being a fully amphibious vehicle, the BTR-60 could safely move troops across bodies of water. Before entering the water, a rear 2-wing lid opened to reveal a water jet, which could propel the vehicle up to 6.2 miles per hour, or about 10 kilometers an hour. A trim vane was also erected at the front to prevent water from flooding over the bow. The BTR-60 was produced from 1960 to 1976 and saw extensive use in countries such as Afghanistan, Cuba, Egypt, Iran, and Ukraine well into the 21st century. It showed several drawbacks, however, one being the armor thickness ranged from 5mm to 9mm, and as such provided good protection against assault rifles from any distance and machine guns at a more considerable distance. But it was ultimately unsatisfactory to withstand the impact of RPG rounds, which were becoming more common. The engine also suffered from a hot climate. The turret elevation of only 30 degrees was a problem because it didn't allow the gunner to engage the enemy attacking from higher ground. By the beginning of the 1980s, most BTR-60s were replaced with newer generation BTR-70s and BTR-80s. Those that remained were sent to border units and exported to third world countries. BTR-70. In 1971, GAZ engineers began developing the BTR-70, the next generation of armored transporters. To improve combat capabilities, the BTR-70 was designed to overcome the drawbacks of its predecessor. To begin, the internal seat arrangements were modified. A seating bench for 6 soldiers was positioned along the middle of the compartment. Soldiers inside sat back to back, each of them facing side fire ports. 2 more soldiers were sitting on single seats behind the crew with their fire ports facing forward, and the space between the second and third axles was increased to add a small exit hatch. The BTR-70 was also powered by 2 ZMZ 4905 115 horsepower or 85.76 kilowatt gasoline engines. Like its predecessor, the BTR-70 was widely used in Afghanistan, showing the same weaknesses. Most notably, though, this vehicle can still be seen on the battlefields in the war in Donbass and the Russo-Ukrainian War. BTR-80. With the BTR-70 showing repeated poor performances in Afghanistan, the Soviets undertook a further evolution of the BTR vehicles, the BTR-80 in 1984. There were 4 main differences between it and the BTR-70, the first being the engine. Instead of twin gasoline engines, the new BTR-80 had a single 260 horsepower or 194 kilowatt turbo V8 diesel engine that called for a new arrangement at the rear of the vehicle. Additionally, because of the engine's position, the water jet box had to be removed. Instead, the BTR-80 had 2 external water jets fitted on the sides of the hull. The third difference was the improved turret. GAZ designers increased the elevation of the turret to 60 degrees. This way, the gunner was allowed to engage an enemy at higher ground and even provide anti-aircraft fire. The new turret also had 6 smoke grenade mortars installed at the rear. Finally, the BTR-80 had 2 side hatches installed to evacuate the soldiers at the troop compartment. The hatch consisted of 2 parts. The upper part was opening forward, providing protection from enemy fire, while the lower part was opening downward to form a ramp. Since 1984, more than 5,000 vehicles have been built. The model is still in the arsenal of the Russian Army and armed forces of former Soviet republics. In 2013, the Russian military industry started the production of a BTR-82A version, equipped with a more powerful 30mm 2A72 automatic gun that can fire armor-piercing tracer APT projectiles, high-explosive fragmentation incendiary HEFI, and high-explosive tracer HET ammunition. The new version was powered by a KAMAZ 740 14300 turbo diesel engine, which generates 300 horsepower. For better ballistic protection, BTR-82A's armor was coated with Kevlar laminated synthetic materials. The Russian Army uses both versions in the current war against Ukraine, while the Ukrainian Army only has the earlier version in its armament. BTR-90. The fourth and the last generation of BTRs, the BTR-90 was first introduced in 1994. With a significantly larger hull, this version could accommodate 10 soldiers in the compartment area, 2 more than previous versions. The inner layout is the same as in prior models, with the new turbocharged liquid-cooled multi-fuel diesel engine positioned at the rear. BTR-90 has a whole new turret taken from the BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle. The turret is armed with a 30mm Shupanov 2A42 gun, a 7.62mm PKT machine gun, and a 9M113 Konkurs anti-tank guided missile launcher. In addition, the turret can be adapted to use a more advanced 9M133 Kornet anti-tank guided missile launcher. Armored protection of the BTR-90 is also improved and can withstand shots from 14.5mm rounds. Furthermore, there is a possibility to increase the protection by adding explosive reactive armor panels. Currently, the BTR-90 is not in the service of the Russian armed forces, and the model is intended for export only, having been overshadowed by the BTR-82.